They blew the whistle at dawn, and by the time the sun touched the ridge, the earth itself seemed to forget how to breathe. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and if you believe in justice that rides silent, hit like and follow. Now back to the story. The sound came low at first, like a warning that did not belong to this land, a long iron cry stretching across miles of open prairie and into the bones of everything that listened. Elias Reed stood beside the fresh-laid rails, boots half buried in pale dust, the smell of hot metal and coal smoke clinging to his coat. He did not move when the ground trembled. He had been told this would happen, that progress always came with noise, but he had never been told it would feel like the land was trying to pull away from him. The second whistle came sharper, cutting through the morning air, and that was when the horizon broke. A dark moving line stretched across the plain, not shadow, not storm, but something alive, something ancient. Thousands of buffalo surging as one, their hooves beating the earth into a rhythm older than any railroad. The dust rose thick, turning gold light into a muted haze, and Elias felt his throat tighten, because the animals were not running with the wind, they were running from it. From the ridge above, a man watched without blinking. Nantan gray hawk stood still as stone, his silhouette carved against the sky, a red cloth tied at his arm lifting slightly in the breeze. He had heard the whistle long before the men below even reached for their hats, because to him it was not just sound, it was interruption. The buffalo had always moved like water across this land, steady, certain, guided by paths no map could hold, but now they twisted, broke, scattered, their movement no longer a circle but a fracture. Elias stepped forward, one slow step, boots crunching gravel as the first wave of animals veered, wide eyes rolling white, not in fear alone but confusion. He could see it now, the way they crossed and doubled back, the way calves stumbled against stronger bodies, the way the rhythm had collapsed into something jagged. The engineer beside him muttered something about testing schedules, about timing and distance, but Elias did not answer, because something in his chest had gone quiet in a way that did not feel right. The train came into view, a black shape cutting forward, steam spilling upward like a storm that refused to fall, its iron body loud, certain, unbending. The whistle screamed again, and the buffalo broke harder, now splitting into two currents that collided against unseen edges of memory, paths that no longer made sense. One young calf turned the wrong way, ran straight toward the rails, then stopped too late, its small frame trembling before darting aside just as the engine thundered past. The ground shook under Elias' feet, and he realized this was not just motion, it was erasure. On the ridge, Nantan lowered his gaze, following the broken pattern below. He did not shout, he did not raise a weapon, he only watched as something sacred lost its shape, and that silence carried more weight than any gun. The wind shifted, bringing with it a smell Elias had never noticed before, not blood, not yet, but something like torn grass and dust, unsettled too quickly, like a story interrupted mid-sentence. A small object rolled across the dirt near the tracks, catching against a spike. Elias bent and picked it up, a charm made of bone, worn smooth by time, tied with a faded strip of leather. It was light in his hand, but it did not feel small. He looked up instinctively toward the ridge, and for a brief second his eyes met Nantan's across the distance. No anger, no threat, just a question that did not need words. The train passed fully now, leaving behind a wake of silence heavier than its noise. The buffalo were gone, or scattered into directions that meant nothing anymore. The prairie stretched wide again, but it did not feel the same. The lines invisible before now felt cut. Elias closed his hand around the small charm, the leather pressing into his palm as if it belonged to the land more than to him, and somewhere far off a single hoofbeat echoed alone, then stopped too soon. The dust did not settle the way it used to. It lingered, as if the ground itself was unsure whether to rest or to keep running. Elias Reed stood with the small bone charm still in his hand, the leather strip now warm against his skin, though the morning air remained cool around him. Behind him the men at the rail camp laughed lightly, relieved the test run had not failed. One of them clapped another on the shoulder, speaking of schedules, profits, and how soon this place would be a proper town. Elias did not turn toward them, instead his eyes followed the faint lines left behind by the buffalo, paths that now twisted without purpose, crossing over themselves like a map drawn by someone who had forgotten the destination. He slipped the charm into his coat pocket, not out of ownership but because leaving it on the ground felt like another kind of wrong. By noon the sun had burned away the last of the morning haze, but something in the air still felt dimmer. The prairie stretched wide, yet it seemed smaller somehow, as if space had been taken rather than filled. Elias walked along the tracks, boots striking the iron edge now and then, hearing that hollow note repeat beneath him, a rhythm too straight, too certain. He remembered what the company man had said, that a straight line was the fastest way forward, but out here nothing had ever moved in straight lines, not the wind, not the water, not the herds, not the people who listened to them. A distant figure waited ahead where the rails curved slightly toward a shallow rise. Elias recognized the stance before he saw the face. Nantan gray hawk stood beside a weathered post, one hand resting lightly on it as if measuring its presence against the land. He did not step closer. When Elias approached, he only tilted his head once, acknowledging, not greeting. The silence between them was not empty, it carried the echo of the whistle, the broken movement, the absence left behind. Elias reached into his coat and held out the charm without speaking. Nantan looked at it for a long moment, then shook his head slowly, not in rejection but in correction. You carry it now, he said, his voice low, steady, like something that had never needed to be raised. Elias frowned slightly. Unsure. You dropped it, he replied. Nantan's eyes shifted toward the open plain, then back to Elias. The land dropped it, he said, and the difference settled heavier than the object itself. Elias lowered his hand, the charm still resting in his palm. The wind moved across the grass in uneven waves, no longer following the old patterns, and for the first time he noticed how quiet it had become. No distant thunder of hooves, no layered sound that once filled the horizon with life, only the faint creak of new wood and the far-off hiss of cooling metal. What happens now? Elias asked, though the question felt smaller than what he meant. Nantan did not answer immediately. He knelt instead, pressing his fingers lightly into the soil, lifting a small pinch and letting it fall again, as if testing whether it still remembered its place. They will come back, he said finally, but not the same, and not for long. Elias followed his gaze, seeing nothing but distance, yet feeling as if something important had already moved beyond sight. The company men say the land will adapt, Elias said quietly, more to himself than to the man beside him. Nantan gave a faint breath that might have been a laugh but carried no humor. The land always adapts, he said, but not always. For those who forget how to listen. A long pause settled between them, then Nantan reached into a small pouch at his side and drew out a strip of worn hide, darker than the dust, marked with faint lines and symbols that Elias could not read. This was taken when the herd still trusted the wind, he said, placing it gently on the post beside him. Now the wind carries something else. Elias did not reach for it, he only watched as the hide lifted slightly in the breeze, then stilled again like a memory trying to hold its shape. In the distance a hammer struck metal. Back at the camp a sharp, deliberate sound repeated again and again, each strike echoing farther than it should. Elias felt each one in his chest, not as noise but as a measure of something being fixed into place, something that would not easily be undone. Why show me this, he asked finally. Nantan stood then, his posture straight, calm. You are the one who hears it differently, he said, nodding faintly toward the tracks. You do not cheer when it sings. Elias looked down at the rails, the sunlight glinting along their surface, turning them into two bright lines that cut across everything he could see. He had thought of them as connection, as movement, as promise, but now they felt like a decision already made long before he arrived, and yet somehow still resting in his hands. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a faint scent of trampled grass and something else, something that did not belong to either camp or herd, something unfinished. Elias closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. The world unchanged, yet no longer simple. The next train would come soon. He knew that the schedule had been set. The spike would be driven, the line would be declared complete, but standing there between the post and the rails, between the charm and the hide, between the silence and the sound, he realized completion did not mean the same thing to everyone, and for the first time since he had come west he was no longer certain which side of that line he stood on. By late afternoon the sky turned the color of old brass and the rail camp moved with a kind of restless pride, men carrying tools as if they were carrying proof that the world could be reshaped by will alone. Elias Reed stood at the edge of that motion, watching as the final length of track was dragged into place, the iron gleaming dull under the fading light. He could hear the supervisor calling orders, voice sharp, confident, each word landing clean as the spikes that would soon follow, and yet beneath that rhythm there was something else, something softer that refused to disappear, the memory of hooves scattering the broken line of movement that had not yet found its way back. He touched the pocket where the bone charm rested, not to reassure himself but to confirm it was still there, as if losing it would mean losing whatever quiet truth it carried. A boy from the camp ran past him barefoot, kicking up dust, laughing without knowing why. The sound felt out of place here, the kind of laughter that belonged to a place where nothing had been taken yet. Elias followed the boy with his eyes until he vanished behind a stack of timber, then turned back toward the open land where the horizon had begun to blur with evening. On the far ridge Nantan Grey Hawk still stood, though the distance between them had grown harder to measure in the dimming light. He had not moved much since midday, and that stillness began to feel like a question that would not go away. A hammer struck metal again, closer now, the first spike of the last section being set. Elias felt the sound travel through the ground into his boots, up into his chest, where it settled like a second heartbeat. One spike, then another, the pattern steady, deliberate, final. Men gathered around, some nodding, some wiping sweat from their brows, even as the air cooled and a bottle passed From hand to hand, small celebrations beginning before the work had fully ended. The supervisor called out for Elias, his voice cutting through the murmur. "Reed, get over here, we are finishing this today." Elias did not answer at first. He looked instead at the line of rail stretching away behind him, straight, unbroken, dividing the land into before and after. He thought of what Nantan had said, that the land adapts, but not always for those who forget how to listen, and for a moment he tried to listen, not to the men, not to the iron, but to the space between sounds where something older still lingered, faint but present. A gust of wind moved across the prairie, lifting loose dust and carrying with it a smell that did not belong to camp or machine, a dry, hollow scent like something once living now turned into memory. Elias stepped forward slowly, each footfall heavier than the last, until he reached the place where the final spike waited, resting beside the rail, a simple piece of iron that somehow held more weight than anything else he had touched. The supervisor smiled tight, handed him the hammer. "This is yours, Reed. You laid most of this line, you get to close it." Elias took the hammer, the wood worn smooth by many hands, the metal head catching the last light of the day. He raised it slightly, testing its balance, hearing in his mind the echo of every strike that had come before and every one that would follow. If this one fell, the men leaned in closer, some silent now, sensing the moment, others still murmuring about schedules, about trains, about the future that would arrive faster than ever before. No one looked toward the ridge except Elias, and when he did, he saw that Nantan had finally moved. Not stepping forward, not retreating, but kneeling once more, his hand pressed to the earth as if holding it in place. Elias lowered the hammer a fraction, not enough to draw notice but enough to feel the difference. He glanced down at the rail, the perfect line, the promise it carried, and the cost it refused to name. Then at the ground beside it, where the dust still held faint traces of paths that had not been meant to cross iron. He could almost see them, overlaying each other, the old and the new, not meeting, not blending, just cutting through. The supervisor cleared his throat, impatient. "Reed, we do not have all night." Elias inhaled slowly, the air cool now, carrying the first hint of night and something else, something like absence. He thought of the calf turning too late, of the scattered herd, of the quiet that followed. He thought of the charm in his pocket and the hide on the post, and the way Nantan had said, "You carry it now," as if carrying meant more than holding. Elias tightened his grip on the hammer, then loosened it again, the motion small but final. He looked up once more toward the ridge, and though the distance blurred details, he could feel the steadiness of the man there, not asking, not demanding, only witnessing. Elias lowered the hammer completely and let it rest against his leg. The murmur around him faltered, confusion moving through the group like a ripple. "Reed," the supervisor said sharper now, "what are you doing?" Elias did not answer. Immediately he stepped back from the rail one pace, then another, creating space where there had been none. The iron line lay unfinished for the first time since it had begun, not broken, not removed, simply not sealed. The silence that followed felt different from the one after the train. It was not empty, it was full of something waiting. The wind passed through again, softer this time, carrying no whistle, no echo, just the sound of grass moving in a pattern that almost remembered itself. Elias slipped his hand into his pocket and closed his fingers around the small bone charm, feeling its worn edges press back as if acknowledging the choice that had not been struck into the ground. And somewhere far off, beyond sight, beyond line, a faint rumble answered, not in fear, not in confusion, but in something closer to return. The sun slipped lower, and with it the noise of the camp thinned into something uncertain, like men who had spoken too loudly, now unsure how to continue. Elias Reed stood apart from the unfinished rail, the hammer no longer in his hand, yet its weight still lingering in his arm, as if the choice he made had settled into his bones. The supervisor's voice rose again, sharper now, edged with disbelief. "Reed, you are stopping a line that runs across half a continent. You think the world pauses because you hesitate." Elias did not turn immediately. He watched the last light stretch across the iron, the rails glowing faintly like something alive, then fading just as quickly, and in that fading he understood something simple and heavy. Not everything that can be finished should be finished. He bent down slowly and pressed his palm against the ground beside the track, the soil still warm from the day, but underneath it there was a cooler, steadier presence, something that did not rush, did not demand, only endured. The men behind him shifted, boots scraping dirt, a few muttering, others falling quiet in a way that felt less like agreement and more like the beginning of doubt. One of them picked up the hammer from where Elias had set it down, holding it uncertainly as if it no longer belonged to any one man. The supervisor stepped closer, his shadow stretching long across the rail. "This is not your decision," he said low, now controlled but tight. Elias finally turned, meeting his gaze without challenge, without defiance, just with a stillness that did not move. "Reed," the supervisor continued, softer, almost persuasive, "we bring people here, we bring trade, food, connection, we make this land useful." Elias listened to the words as they settled between them. "Useful," he repeated quietly, tasting the word as if it might reveal something more. The supervisor nodded, relieved to hear him speak. "Yes, useful." Elias glanced past him toward the open plain where dusk had begun to gather, and for a moment the wind shifted, carrying a Distant sound so faint it could have been imagined a low rolling tremor like the memory of hooves not near, not visible but present enough to be felt. He looked back at the supervisor and asked, and before that what was it? The question hung in the air, not loud, not demanding, but impossible to ignore. The supervisor frowned, unsure whether to answer or dismiss it as the rambling of a man who had spent too long in open space before he could respond. Another voice entered, not from the camp but from beyond it. Nantan Grey Hawk had come down from the ridge, his steps measured, unhurried, until he stood at the edge of the gathered men, not inside their circle, not outside it either, but exactly where the line between them would have been if anyone had thought to draw one. No one reached for a weapon, no one spoke, his presence alone shifted the air. The supervisor straightened instinctively, his posture tightening. "We are working here," he said, as if that explained everything. Nantan looked at him once, then lowered his gaze to the unfinished rail, his expression unchanged. "This line is not complete," he said simply. The supervisor gave a short laugh. "It will be in a minute." Elias closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, turning slightly so that both men stood within his view. He understood now this moment was not about stopping the railroad entirely, not about undoing what had already been laid. It was about something smaller and somehow larger, the meaning of this last act, the way it would be remembered, the way it would be carried forward. He reached into his coat and brought out the bone charm, holding it up so that the fading light caught its worn surface. "The land dropped this," he said, echoing the words he had been given earlier, "and now I decide whether to drop something back." The men watched, uncertain, some confused, others uneasy, the supervisor impatient. "Then what is that supposed to mean?" Elias stepped forward, placing the charm carefully on the ground beside the rail, not on the iron, not hidden beneath it, but where both could be seen together. "The railroad will stand," he said quietly, "because it already does, but this place will not be where it pretends. The land had no voice before it arrived." Nantan's eyes lifted slightly, not in approval, not in surprise, but in recognition. Elias continued, his voice steady, "I will drive the spike tomorrow, not today, and when I do it will not be called the beginning, it will be marked as the crossing." The supervisor opened his mouth to argue, then paused, something in Elias' tone leaving little room for dismissal. "A crossing," he repeated slowly, as if the word itself resisted him. Elias nodded. "A place where two things meet and neither claims to erase the other." The wind moved again, softer now, and in the distance that faint tremor returned, a little stronger this time, not a full herd, not the thunder of before, but enough to remind the land of its own rhythm. Nantan stepped closer. Then just one pace and knelt, placing his hand once more against the earth. Then after a moment he placed the strip of hide beside the charm, the two objects resting together between rail and soil. The men did not speak, the supervisor did not interrupt. The light faded completely, leaving only the outline of what had not yet been decided, and in that quiet Elias understood that sometimes the only justice a man could offer was not to finish what the world expected, but to name it honestly before it was done. And somewhere beyond sight, beyond iron, beyond certainty, the land breathed again, not fully, not freely, but enough to remember itself. Night settled slow and wide across the prairie, the kind of night that did not fall but spread inch by inch until even the rails seemed to dim into the earth. Elias Reed remained where he stood long after the men drifted back toward the camp, their voices low, uncertain, as if something in the air had asked them to speak softer than before. The unfinished track lay beside him, two lines fading into darkness, stopping just short of the place where the charm and the strip of hide rested together. Neither claimed, neither moved. The wind carried a different sound now, not the sharp cry of the train, not the hollow strike of hammer on iron, but a long quiet breath that seemed to pass through grass and soil alike, as if the land itself was testing whether it could still exhale. Elias crouched, slowly lowering himself until he sat beside the rail, his back straight, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He had not chosen a side, not in the way men in town spoke of sides, with lines drawn and names given. He had only refused to let one story swallow another whole, and somehow that felt heavier than any decision he had made before. A small fire flickered in the distance back at the camp, its glow steady but contained, while out here the darkness felt larger, deeper, more honest. The stars began to show, one by one, faint at first, then clearer, until the sky stretched wide above him, untouched by iron or schedule. He looked up at them longer than he had in years, realizing that for all the miles he had helped build, he had rarely stopped to notice what had always been there. Nantan Grey Hawk had not left. He sat a short distance away, not close, not far. The space between them held with the same quiet understanding as before. Neither man spoke for a long time. The silence was not empty, it carried weight, memory, and something like agreement that did not need to be named. After a while Elias reached into his coat and removed the small piece of folded paper he carried, the company map, lines drawn clean and straight, cutting across the territory with no hesitation, no Curve no pause. He unfolded it carefully, the edges worn from use, and placed it on the ground between them. The map looked different now, smaller, somehow less certain, the lines no longer feeling like direction but like insistence. Nantan glanced at it briefly, then back to the land around them. His voice when it came was soft. The paper does not move. Elias gave a slight nod. No, it does not. Nantan touched the ground lightly beside him. This does. Elias followed the gesture, watching as a faint breeze shifted the grass in uneven waves, not straight, not predictable but continuous. He thought of the men who would arrive, the towns that would grow, the goods that would pass through faster than ever before, all of it real, all of it already beginning. And yet here in this moment he felt the presence of something just as real, that could not be measured or owned, only respected or ignored. He reached forward and folded the map again, slower this time, as if the act itself required more care than before. Then tucked it back into his coat, not as a guide but as a reminder of what it could not show. A distant sound rose, low and steady, not close enough to see, not strong enough to shake the ground, but unmistakable. A gathering movement far beyond the horizon. Elias did not turn toward it immediately. He let it reach him first, through the air, through the soil, through that quiet place in his chest that had opened earlier in the day. When he finally looked up, his eyes moved across the dark plain, searching not for shapes but for pattern, for the return of something that had been broken and might yet find its way again. Nantan stood then slowly, not in alarm, not in urgency but in recognition. He did not step toward the sound, he simply faced it, his posture calm as if greeting something familiar that had been gone too long. Elias rose as well, brushing dust from his coat, though the gesture felt more habit than necessity. They stood side by side, not aligned, not opposed, just present as the faint rumble continued, steady, patient. The charm and the strip of hide lay between the rail and the earth, catching a sliver of starlight just enough to be seen if one knew where to look. The rail itself remained silent for once, no echo, no vibration, just a line waiting for a choice that would come with the morning. Elias glanced at Nantan, then back at the horizon, and spoke quietly, almost to himself. Tomorrow does not have to sound the same. Nantan did not answer with words, but his stillness held agreement enough. The night deepened around them and the prairie breathed again, not in full voice, not yet, but in a way that no longer felt broken. And for the first time since the whistle had torn through the dawn, Elias understood that silence was not the absence of sound, it was the space where something true could return if a man was willing to leave it unfilled. Dawn returned without announcement, just a slow light rising behind the ridge, turning the edges of the world visible again. Elias Reed had not slept. He remained near the unfinished rail where the ground still held the faint imprint of yesterday choices, the charm and the strip of hide resting where they had been placed, neither disturbed, neither claimed. The camp stirred behind him, quieter than before, men moving with purpose but without the easy confidence that had filled their voices the day before. Coffee boiled somewhere, a horse shifted its weight, leather creaking, soft familiar sounds, yet even these seemed to pause between themselves as if listening for something beyond habit. Elias stood and looked east, the sky pale, stretching wide over a land that did not rush to greet the morning. He felt the weight of the coming decision, not as pressure from others but as a line inside himself, one that could not be crossed without knowing exactly what it meant. The supervisor approached, boots firm against the dirt, coat pulled tight against the early chill. Reed, we finish this today, he said, not loud, not harsh, just certain. Elias turned slightly, meeting him with the same quiet steadiness he had found during the night. Yes, he said, we finish it, but we do not name it the same. The supervisor's jaw tightened. He glanced down at the objects beside the rail, then back at Elias. You are still holding on to that? Elias followed his gaze. The charm, the hide, two small things carrying more history than the iron beside them. It is not about holding on, he said, it is about not pretending. The men nearby slowed their movements, not stopping entirely but close enough that the space around the rail began to fill with attention rather than noise. Nantan Grey Hawk stood again on the ridge, not as distant now in the morning light, his figure clear against the sky. He had returned to that place where the land could be seen whole, where no single line could claim it. Elias lifted the hammer from where it rested, the wood cool, the weight familiar. He stepped forward onto the packed earth beside the rail, placing his boots carefully, avoiding the charm, avoiding the hide, not out of superstition but out of respect. The final spike lay ready, its metal catching the first direct light of the sun, a simple object waiting to become something more or something less depending on how it was placed. Elias raised the hammer slowly, feeling every eye on him, the supervisor's expectation, the workers' uncertainty, the quiet presence on the ridge, and something deeper, something that did not belong to any person present. He paused, not long, just enough for the moment to settle into itself. Then he spoke, his voice steady, carrying without force. This line will stand, he said, it will carry people, goods and stories. Across miles that once took seasons, but it will not stand as if nothing was here before. He lowered the hammer slightly, then continued, this place is not the beginning, it is a crossing, and we will mark it that way. The supervisor shifted as if to interrupt, then stopped, something in the tone leaving no room for dismissal. Elias nodded once to himself, then drove the spike down. The sound rang out clear, sharp, cutting through the morning air, but it did not echo the same way the previous strikes had. It seemed to settle quicker, absorbed by the ground rather than carried away. He struck again and again, each blow measured, not rushed, until the spike sat firm, holding the rail in place without sealing over what lay beside it. When he finished, he stepped back, lowering the hammer to his side, not dropping it, not claiming it, simply releasing the act. The silence that followed was not empty, it held the sound of what had just been done and the meaning that had been given to it. The supervisor exhaled slowly, looking at the finished section, then at the objects beside it, still visible, still present. He said nothing for once. The men returned to their tasks, but their movements carried a different weight now, less like conquest, more like participation in something they did not fully control. Elias bent and picked up the charm, turning it once in his fingers, then placed it back down exactly where it had been, beside the rail, not hidden, not displayed, simply there. He looked up toward the ridge. Nantan remained still, but there was a slight shift in his posture, something almost like acknowledgement, though no gesture was made. The wind moved across the prairie, carrying with it a faint, distant tremor, not strong, not close, but steady enough to be real. Elias listened without turning toward it, letting the sound arrive on its own terms. The line was complete now in the way the company would record it, but the place itself felt unfinished in a way that mattered more, and that unfinished space felt right, as if something had been left open on purpose. He rested the hammer against the ground and stepped back from the rail, creating distance between himself and the work, not in rejection but in recognition that it no longer belonged to him alone. The sun climbed higher, light spreading across the land, touching iron, grass and sky alike without choosing between them, and in that shared light the crossing held both what had come before and what would come next, without forcing either to disappear. And somewhere beyond the visible edge of the world the rhythm of hooves continued, not lost, not whole, but returning in its own time, answering not to the whistle but to something older that had never needed to be named. The work did not stop after the spike was driven, it only changed its voice. The days that followed moved forward with the same rhythm of labor, men laying timber, securing iron, measuring distance, but something subtle had shifted in the way they stood on the land, as if each step now carried a question beneath it. Elias Reed noticed it in small things, first the way a man paused before clearing brush, the way another looked up when the wind changed direction, the way the laughter at dusk came softer, less certain, as though each of them had begun to hear what had always been there beneath the noise. The crossing took shape without ceremony, no signboard, no grand speech, just a place where the rail met the memory of movement and did not pretend otherwise. Travelers would pass through it without knowing at first, wagons rattling over the earth beside the track, horses snorting at the unfamiliar scent of iron and smoke, the train itself arriving and leaving on schedule, its whistle still sharp but somehow less absolute, as if the land had learned how to carry the sound without letting it claim everything. Elias found himself walking the line at different hours, morning, noon, dusk, each time noticing how the light changed what the rails seemed to say. In the morning they reflected the sky, pale and open. In the afternoon they burned bright, almost blinding. In the evening they darkened into something quieter, less certain, as if even iron could learn restraint. He did not speak much to the men anymore. Not because there was nothing to say, but because what mattered could not be explained in the language of orders and plans. Instead he listened more to the ground, to the wind, to the spaces between sounds where something patient continued to exist. Nantan Grey Hawk did not come to the camp, but he was never entirely absent. Elias would see him sometimes on the ridge or farther out, moving along paths that did not follow the rail, always at a distance that felt intentional, not avoidance, not distance but balance. One afternoon as the sun leaned west, Elias followed the faint line of grass that bent differently from the rest, a trace of movement that had not yet been erased. It led him away from the tracks, beyond the reach of hammer and voice, into a part of the prairie that still held its own rhythm. The air there felt different, cooler, not in temperature but in tone, as if it carried fewer demands. He walked until the sounds of the camp disappeared, completely replaced by the soft sweep of wind and the distant low murmur that had begun to return, not strong, not whole, but present enough to be believed. When he reached the shallow rise he stopped. Nantan stood there already waiting, though Elias had not seen him approach. The two men regarded each other without greeting, the space between them filled with something steadier, now less uncertain. You hear it, Elias said quietly, not as a question but as recognition. Nantan nodded. Once they are finding the old paths again, he replied, his voice calm but carrying a note that had not been there before, something like cautious relief. Elias looked out across the land, his eyes tracing movements too subtle for most to notice, slight shifts in the grass patterns, changes in the way birds circled overhead, signs that the rhythm of the place was not Gone only interrupted. He felt a slow release in his chest, not joy, not triumph, but something closer to alignment, as if a piece that had been out of place had begun to settle. You did not stop the rail, Nantan said after a moment. Elias shook his head. No, I could not. Nantan's gaze remained steady. You did not let it speak alone. Elias considered that, then nodded. That felt closer to the truth. The wind passed between them, lifting the edges of their coats, carrying with it that same low, distant tremor, a sound that no longer felt like memory alone but like return. It will never be as it was, Elias said, not with regret but with acceptance. Nantan's eyes followed the horizon. It was never meant to stay the same, he said, but it was not meant to be forgotten either. The words settled into the space around them, simple, unforced, and complete. Elias glanced back toward where the rail cut through the distance, a straight line, still visible, still present, but no longer the only story written across the land. He understood then that what had been done at the crossing had not undone the loss. It had only made room for truth to remain beside it, and sometimes that was the only form of justice left available. As the sun dipped lower, the light stretched long across the prairie, touching both the rail and the open ground without choosing between them, and in that shared glow the two men stood not as opposites, not as allies in the way towns might name it, but as witnesses to a balance that had not been fully broken. The sound of hooves grew slightly stronger now, still far, still scattered, but steady enough to promise continuation. Elias did not follow it. He did not need to. He simply listened, letting it arrive on its own time, understanding that not everything worth preserving could be carried forward by force. Some things required space, silence, and the willingness to stand still long enough for them to return, and in that quiet he realized the crossing would not be remembered for the rail that passed through it, but for the moment a man chose not to let one world erase another, even as both moved forward into the same uncertain horizon. Evening came slower that day, as if the sun itself hesitated to leave the crossing. Elias Reed stood beside the rail, not working, not directing, just watching the way light settled differently now that the line had been named for what it was. The men had grown used to the place, though none spoke of it directly. They stepped around the charm and the strip of hide without being told, leaving that small space untouched as if it belonged to something beyond their tasks. Wagons had already begun to pass, a few traders moving goods along the newly shortened route, their wheels creaking steady, their eyes fixed ahead, most of them not noticing the difference in the ground beneath them, but a few slowed just slightly, their gaze drifting toward the objects by the rail, then away again, as if something there could not be easily understood. Elias saw it in their faces, that brief moment of recognition followed by uncertainty, and then the choice to continue anyway, and he realized that was how change truly moved, not all at once but in small quiet acknowledgments that refused to disappear entirely. The train arrived just before dusk, its approach no longer a shock but still not fully ordinary. The whistle cut through the air sharp and clear, yet it seemed to fade quicker now, absorbed by the space that had been left open. The engine rolled through the crossing, its iron body steady, its purpose unchanged, but as it passed over that final section where the spike had been driven with a different meaning, something in its sound shifted just slightly, not enough for most to notice but enough for Elias to feel the vibration beneath his boots, carried through the ground, then softened as if the land itself had learned how to hold it without breaking. The passengers looked out from the windows, some curious, some indifferent, their reflections catching the last light of the day, blending with the landscape in a way that made it hard to tell where one ended and the other began. The train moved on, leaving behind a trail of smoke that stretched across the sky before thinning into nothing, and in its wake the silence returned, not empty, not hollow, but full of what had not been taken. Nantan Grey Hawk stood once more on the ridge, his figure familiar now against the horizon, a presence that did not intrude, did not withdraw, simply remained. Elias glanced toward him, then back at the crossing, understanding that the moment they had shared was not something to be repeated or explained, it was something to be carried quietly forward in the way a man stood in the world, in the choices he made when no one demanded them. The supervisor approached again, though his tone had changed, less sharp, less certain. Reed, he said after a pause, the line is being recorded as complete. Tomorrow the report goes east. Elias nodded without turning. He had expected this. Words would be written, numbers counted, distances measured, all of it clean and certain on paper. The supervisor hesitated, then added, "They will call this progress." Elias let the word settle into the evening air, hearing it the same way he had before but understanding it differently now. "Progress," he said slowly, "does not need to forget what it passes through." The supervisor did not respond immediately. He looked down at the ground, at the charm, at the strip of hide, then out across the prairie where the light had begun to fade into long shadows. "I do not know if they will understand," he admitted. Elias gave a small nod. "They do not have to." The wind moved across the land, carrying with it that low, distant tremor, again stronger. Now not hidden, not imagined, the sound of hooves returning in scattered lines, not yet a heard, not yet the thunder of before, but enough to be known. Elias did not smile, he did not step forward, he simply stood and listened, letting the sound arrive without claiming it. Nantan shifted slightly on the ridge, a small movement that caught the last of the light, then stilled again. The two men did not speak across the distance, they did not need to. The crossing held between them a place where something had been named honestly and left open enough for both memory and change to pass through. As the final light slipped below the horizon, the prairie darkened into a deep quiet, the kind that did not erase what had come before but carried it forward in ways that could not be seen. The rail remained, the land remained, the story remained, and in that stillness Elias understood that the world would continue to move, trains would run, towns would grow, people would call it progress, and perhaps they would be right. But here in this place there would always be a mark, not carved, not written, but held in the way the ground had not been forced to forget. And for a man who had once believed that building meant finishing everything, that small unfinished truth felt like the only thing that truly held. The night after the train passed felt different from the ones before, not because it was quieter but because the quiet now carried a kind of memory that refused to fade. Elias Reed walked the length of the crossing alone, his boots pressing into the same ground that had held the weight of hooves, iron wheels and unspoken choices. The stars above stretched wide and steady, untouched by the lines men had drawn below, and for the first time he understood how small even the longest railroad truly was against a sky that did not bend. The charm and the strip of hide still rested where they had been placed, their presence no longer strange, no longer fragile, but rooted as if they had always belonged there. Elias stopped beside them and lowered himself slowly to one knee, his hand hovering just above the earth, not touching, not claiming, only acknowledging. The air carried a faint rhythm again, not strong, not near, but real enough to be felt through the soles of his boots, a distant gathering that did not rush, did not force its return, but came as all things here once had, steady, patient, certain in its own time. He closed his eyes briefly and listened, not for sound alone but for what moved beneath it, the way the land spoke without words, the way absence could become presence again if it was not sealed over too quickly. When he opened his eyes, the rail beside him caught a thin line of starlight stretching forward into darkness, a path that would carry countless stories, none of them able to erase the one that now lived here beside it. He stood and turned toward the ridge, though he could barely make out its outline in the night. He knew Nantan Grey Hawk was there, not because he saw him but because the balance of the place felt held in a way it had not before. The crossing no longer belonged to one side or the other, it had become something quieter, something harder to name, a place where memory and movement passed each other without being forced to disappear. The following morning came clear and cool, the kind of morning that made everything seem sharper, more defined, as if the world itself had decided to be seen honestly. The supervisor gathered the men, reading from a sheet of paper numbers, distances, completion times, all spoken in a voice that aimed for certainty but no longer carried it fully. Elias listened from the edge of the group, hearing each word land but not settle the way it once would have. When the reading ended, the supervisor hesitated, then looked out toward the crossing, toward the place where the charm and the hide lay in the open sunlight. He said nothing about them, did not try to explain or remove them. He simply folded the paper and turned away, as if understanding that some things did not belong in reports. The work moved on as it always would. Trains came and went, schedules were kept, new faces arrived bringing with them expectations that did not yet know the story of this place. Some asked questions when they noticed the objects beside the rail, others did not, but over time the crossing began to carry its own quiet reputation, not written, not marked on any map, but passed from one traveler to another in the way people speak when something feels different, though they cannot fully say why. They would slow their steps just slightly, look out across the land a little longer than necessary, then continue on, carrying with them a feeling they might not name but would not forget. Elias remained for a while longer, though his work on the line was done. He found reasons to stay, small tasks that did not need him but allowed him to remain near the place where his understanding had shifted. He no longer thought of himself as the man who had helped build the railroad, but as the man who had learned when not to finish it all the way, and when the time came for him to leave he did so without ceremony, packing his few belongings, saddling his horse and taking one last look at the crossing. The rail stretched on as it always would, the land stretched further still, and between them the small space where two objects lay side by side held more truth than any length of iron ever could. He did not take the charm, he did not take the hide, he left them where they belonged, then turned and rode west, not following the rail but moving alongside it at a distance where he could still hear both the whistle and the wind without letting either one drown the other. And long after he was gone the crossing remained, not as a monument, not as a victory, but as a quiet reminder that out here justice did not need to be loud, it only needed a man willing to leave something unfinished so that something else could live. Morning stretched into noon, and noon into a long quiet afternoon that seemed unwilling to end, as if the Land itself had chosen to linger in the space that had been left open. Elias Reed was already gone by then, his tracks fading into the west, carried away by wind and time, but the crossing remained holding its place without needing a witness. The rail continued to shine under the sun, its purpose unchanged, its path certain, yet beside it the small resting place of the charm and the strip of hide gathered a different kind of attention, one that did not call for noise or explanation. Travelers came and passed, some on horseback, some in wagons, some inside the rumbling train that now moved with practiced regularity across the line. Most saw only the iron and the horizon beyond it, but a few noticed the way the ground shifted ever so slightly near that final spike, the way the air seemed to settle differently there, as if it carried a memory that had not been smoothed away. One such traveler, a woman with dust on her boots and no hurry in her pace, stopped just long enough to kneel near the objects, her hand hovering as Elias once had, not touching, not taking, simply acknowledging before she stood and continued on her way, leaving nothing behind but a quieter step. Others followed in their own time, each bringing nothing, each taking something they could not quite name, and in this way the crossing began to live, not as a place marked on maps but as a moment carried from one life to another, passed along without words, without instruction. The men who worked the line grew used to it, though none claimed ownership of that small space. They built around it, measured near it, even repaired sections of track beside it, yet they never moved what lay there, and over time even the newest among them learned without being told that some parts of the land were not meant to be arranged to fit a plan. The supervisor himself returned once, standing alone at dusk where the light fell long across the rail and the prairie beyond. He looked down at the charm and the hide, then out toward the open land where the wind moved in slow steady patterns, and for a moment he removed his hat, holding it at his side, not in ritual, not in habit, but in a quiet recognition that did not need to be recorded. He stayed only a short while, then left, as the others had not changed perhaps, but no longer entirely certain. The seasons shifted as they always would, the heat of summer giving way to the cooler breath of autumn, the grasses changing color, the sky deepening into shades that held more silence than before, and through it all the sound of hooves continued to return, not as the overwhelming thunder it once had been, but as something steadier, more deliberate, a rhythm rebuilding itself across distance and time. The herds did not follow the exact paths of before. Those lines had been altered in ways that could not be undone, but they moved again with purpose, finding new routes that bent around the rail rather than breaking against it, and in that movement there was no surrender, only adaptation, shaped by memory rather than forced by fear. Nantan Grey Hawk remained part of that quiet watch, his presence seen less often as the seasons passed, yet never entirely gone. Those who looked carefully would sometimes glimpse him on a distant ridge or along a line of grass that did not follow the iron, always at the edge, always within the balance that had been preserved. He did not speak to the travelers, he did not stand before the trains, he simply continued to witness the land as it remembered itself, and that was enough. The crossing endured through sun and wind, through passing wheels and distant storms, never growing larger, never claiming attention, yet never fading either. It held its truth the way the earth holds the imprint of a step long after the foot has lifted, not visible to all but present for those who know how to look. And so the story did not end with the laying of the rail, nor with the leaving of a man, nor with the quiet return of hooves. It continued in the space between things, in the choice that had been made not to let one voice erase another, and in the understanding that out here justice did not arrive with force or declaration. It settled slowly like dust in evening light, carried by those who passed through, and left unchanged in ways they would only understand much later, when they found themselves standing in some other place, faced with a line to draw or not to draw, and remembering without knowing why that sometimes the most important thing a man can do is leave room for something else to remain.